and welcome again to Wine 101 on the Road. I'm your host, Scott Sullivan, and I am standing in a rather large winery with a very distinguished gentleman here, winemaker and owner, Bob Lindquist of Qupe Wines. And one of the first things that we found out coming here was this winery or facility was called CVL. CLV. And what does CLV stand for?
It's Clendenin Lindquist Vintners. I share the facility with Jim Clendenin. Obviously, I'm the Lindquist part, and it's a overhead company that pays the overhead of this facility. Jim is the owner of a Bon Climat winery, and myself and a partner are the owners of Qupe. And together Jim and I share this winemaking facility, so that's what CLV is.
Okay, and I'm looking and I see a Bon Climat and I see a Qupe. I also see Verdad. How does that fit into this?
That's my wife's company. I'm a partner in it, but she runs it. She does all the heavy lifting for Verdad. It's a label that's dedicated to Spanish varieties, so Albarino, Tempranillo, Grenache Rosé, and a little bit of Graciano, which coincidentally just was picked today.
Graciano?
Yeah.
So she does Spanish varietals, you as well?
I don't do Spanish varieties. I focus on the Rhone varietals, so mostly Syrah. That's kind of what we hang our hat on. But I also make a fair amount of Grenache. And then in the whites, I make Marsanne, Roussanne, and Viognier. And then from the very beginning, I've made Chardonnay, which is one of the great grapes of the Central Coast. So Chardonnay is our biggest production white wine. Syrah by far our biggest production wine, period.
Okay, so we've got Spain covered, and we've got the Rhone covered, and we're talking about Au Bon Climat. What wines does he make?
Mostly Burgundian varietals, so mostly Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, but also things like Pinot Blanc and Pinot Gris. And I should mention that Louise and I actually make a tiny amount of Pinot Noir as well, so we cover that base as well, but it's tiny.
So you've got three well-known brands. You've got three great winemakers, owners combining in one facility. How does that work? How do you harvest together? How does all this come together?
In a year like this, it's complicated because harvest was early and it's been relentless. It's been kind of warmer than normal all harvest period, so everything kind of ripened within a real compact time frame. So, but normally, Au Bon Climat and Qupe are by far larger than Verdad, so that's kind of what drives the logistics here. And Jim is more front-loaded in the harvest with Pinot Noir, that ripens early. I'm more back-loaded in the harvest with Syrah, which ripens late. So I do more late ripening varieties. He does more early ripening varieties, so we can use the equipment throughout the harvest season. And usually the harvest season is 8, 10, 12 weeks. So it's kind of spread out, and we can be a little more efficient by doing it that way.
Now your fruit is sourced. You're talking about a lot of different grapes here, so what is your philosophy on sourcing your fruit?
Well, we work with three primary vineyards. We work with by far our largest source is Bien Nacido Vineyard, which is where we are right now. We're standing on Bien Nacido Vineyard. Jim and I have leased this space from the Miller family that owns Bien Nacido since 1989. Wow. And I've sourced grapes from Bien Nacido since 1987, so we have a long relationship with them. And then we have a little vineyard down in Los Olivos called the Ibarra Young Vineyard. It's a 14-acre vineyard that we farm ourselves, farm it organically, and that's a small but special part of what we do. And then Louisa and I planted a vineyard up in the Edna Valley that we call the Sawyer Lindquist Vineyard. Wow. And we planted that in 2005, got the first crop in 2008. And that's the vineyard that we farm biodynamically. We've been farming it biodynamically from day one, and in 2009 got the vineyard and the winery Demeter certified.
So is it Rhone or Spanish up in the Edna Valley, or so you do both?
We have both, and we also have a little bit of Pinot. That's where we have the Pinot planted.
Okay, so you're doing that. It's a good area for Pinot?
It is.
That's great.
Yeah, when we planted it, it was 2005, so the year right after Sideways, and the Edna Valley is a great area for Pinot. So as we were considering what to plant, it just seems stupid not to plant a little bit of Pinot Noir, when it would be, in a perfect area for it when Pinot Noir was at its, zenith in popularity.
So here we are in 2014. That's, goodness, 25 years ago or more. You've been making wine or been involved in actually the property surrounding wine and stuff. Did you start making wine here in this area, or what's your history?
Well, I started making wine in this area. I've been in the wine business my whole adult life. I started off in sales, working in a retail store, working in a tasting room, working for a distributor, doing kind of all the different aspects of sales. And then I landed a job in 1979 at a little wine shop in Los Olivos that was owned by the son of the owner of Zaca Mesa Winery. And while at that shop, I met Jim Clendenin, who was the assistant winemaker at Zaca Mesa at the time. We became friends, and 9 months later, I got a job at Zaca Mesa. I was actually hired as their first tour guide, and we didn't get very many tourists, so most of my time was spent working in the cellar. And Jim taught me winemaking. He kind of took me under his wing and became my mentor, as it were.
Wow.
And most of my time was spent learning how to make wine. And then when tourists would show up, I'd stop, show them around, taste some wine, and then they'd leave, and I'd go back to working in the cellar. So a few years later after that, 1982, I decided to start my own business. So started Qupe that year, making the wines while I was still working at Zaca Mesa and renting space from them to make my first 2 vintages.
Wow. That's a long time. That's a lot of experience. You got 3 masters of making wine here and working it out together. When you started here, did you know you wanted to do Rhones? Was it the area that told you, or what made you really focus on Rhones?
That's a really good question, because Rhone varieties at that time, and we're talking, you know, late 70s, early 80s, were not grown too much here, but there had been there'd been a nascent attempt at it at that point by Joseph Phelps Vineyard up in Napa Valley, and by Estrella River Vineyard up in Paso Robles. So there were a couple people making Syrah, and I'm talking now just about Syrah, but I loved and love, I should say, Rhone wines, especially those that are made from Syrah from the Northern Rhone. That's kind of what I prefer in the Rhone Valley. And on an early sales trip, when I worked at Zaca Mesa, I also did some outside sales. On an early sales trip that I was doing to the Bay Area, I visited Kermit Lynch's wine shop, and it was at that point in Albany before he moved to Berkeley. And Kermit happened to be there that day, and he kind of got on his soapbox when I introduced myself. He got on his soapbox about California wines, and he was, you shouldn't be planting Cabernet, you shouldn't be planting Chardonnay, you should be planting Syrah and Grenache and Mourvèdre and Marsanne and Roussanne. He kind of, you know, got on this Rhone kick, and, you know,
good for him.
Well, and obviously he wasn't right about Chardonnay, Cabernet, and Pinot Noir, because those do really well in California. We just had to find the right places to plant them and the right way to grow them and so forth. But what he was right about was that the Rhone varieties would excel here. And I find that they especially excel here on the Central Coast because of the kind of unique climate that we have here.
Okay, if I got just 1 minute to talk about that. You said you prefer the Northern Rhone, or the Syrahs from the north of that region. What characteristics, or why in particular? Is it climate, or is it a combination, or is it the finished product, the flavor that you like?
All of the above. You know, the Syrahs of the Northern Rhone, you know, first of all, the Northern Rhone is quite a bit cooler than the Southern Rhone. Red wines from the Southern Rhone are based more on a blend and based more on Grenache, where the wines of the Northern Rhone are based on Syrah. And Syrah grown in a cooler climate gets a real spicy, gamey, meaty kind of character that's very distinctive and very sought after, you know, by connoisseurs. It's a very distinctive type of wine. Hermitage, Côte Rôtie,
Sure.
Those would be the most famous appellations of the Northern Rhone. Here on the Central Coast, it's different in the respect that we are in California. We have kind of milder growing conditions, but we have a cool climate here on the Central Coast. So we have a similar kind of climate to the Northern Rhone in some ways, but we arrive at it differently. We have more sunshine here, so we get a little more fruit in our wines. But here on the Central Coast, because of the cool climate, and especially in cool vintages, this one not being one, we get those similar kind of characteristics. Pepper, spice, meat, gaminess, bacon fat, the kind of characteristics that you get in Côte Rôtie or Hermitage.
Man, I'm getting thirsty right now. So this sounds fabulous. So you were probably one of the first ones to start really seriously producing or doing Syrahs here.
I was, yeah. And a lot of other people had the same idea around the same time. I happened to be the first guy in Santa Barbara County to make a Syrah.
Fantastic.
But my alma mater, Zaca Mesa, had already planted some at that point in time. So they actually made their first one in 1983, a year after I made my first one in '82. And a good friend of mine, Adam Tolmack from Ojai Vineyard, he had also planted some down in Ojai, down near Ventura, and got his first crop in '83. So, and then Randall Graham made his first Syrah in '83. So there was a lot of movement in that direction. I just happened to be right in the middle of it all.
So now we're in Arizona, and we are talking with wineries there as they are cutting their teeth and learning what grows where and how to make these wines. What process did you go through from the beginning, learning about what rootstock worked better, or maybe what clone, or what worked with this climate? I mean, if you can, tell us about where you are now and how it's evolved into the Syrahs you're making today.
Sure. Well, obviously I learned a lot about the climate when I was working at Zaca Mesa, because that was kind of my initiation here. So we got to see what kind of acidities and flavors that grapes like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir had, but without experience with the Rhone varieties. But when I started, I was buying Syrah grapes from Paso Robles. There was a vineyard planted up there by Gary Eberly at a vineyard called Estrella River. This was before he started his own eponymous winery. And the grapes that I got from Paso Robles, I always had to add acid to. They didn't have enough acidity. And that indicated to me that Syrah should be grown in a cooler climate. And sure enough, here, we rarely have to add acid. In fact, in most years we don't. This year we are, because we're having a warmer vintage. We're having to add a little bit of acid. But anyway, so that's how I learned climatically that this would be a good area for the Rhone varieties. The Rhone varieties ripen late, as I mentioned earlier, and we have kind of unusual weather here because of the east-west orientation of the valleys and mountains here. We have a long, cool summer, which is why Chardonnay and Pinot Noir do well here. And then we have some of our best weather in September and October. So the late ripening varieties can hang out there and eventually ripen. And in most years, we're harvesting Syrah, Grenache, and Roussanne at the end of October, sometimes into early November. This year, we're harvesting them now.
6 to 8 weeks early, yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It is crazy.
So is it now your Syrahs, you have so many, do you put them in barrels separately and then do tasting and blending at that?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There is some blending sometimes depending on the, like I'll blend some different clones together or something like that in the fermenter first, but from the same vineyard. I work in kind of small lots, and then I also make a Syrah that we just simply call Central Coast, and that's a blend of a number of different vineyards. Some of that is made up of those small lots and maybe barrels that I didn't use for single vineyard bottlings. And then some of the lots that are used for Central Coast Syrah are done in bigger tanks, and because we know that they're going to go into that program.
And in the style of Northern Rhone, are you adding any Viognier to any of them, or?
I'm not, just because we don't have the right, nothing against that concept, it works, but we don't really have the situation here that they have in Côte Rôtie, which is the reason that they planted Viognier in with the Syrah to begin with, in that in Côte Rôtie, it used to be that it was difficult to get Syrah ripe. And they found that having Viognier, which ripened 2 to 3 weeks earlier, mixed in with the field, in the field blend, boosted the sugar, and then they also liked the way that it kind of enhanced the perfume and kind of gave it its own distinct Côte Rôtie character. Here, we have the opposite problem. We can easily get Syrah ripe, and by the time Syrah is ripe here, Viognier is overripe. And so it doesn't mean that it can't work, but it's a little more difficult here. If all things being equal, if you grew them side by side in the same vineyard here, you would have that situation. By the time the Syrah reached, let's say, 13 or 14% potential alcohol, the Viognier would be 16 or 17% potential alcohol. So,
wow.
yeah.
Well, that's crazy. That's what's so interesting when you come around and you meet these people or you read about what they're doing here. They are taking what the land gives them, and they use the immense wealth of knowledge and experience to put together things that fit and work in this area. And our crew knows that Central Coast California is putting out some of the best wines. And they've got 3 different ones, as we discussed here. But in addition to that, they're also conscious of the environment. And one of the things that's really, popular is biodynamic. So if you don't mind for 1 minute, tell us a little bit about the difference between organic versus biodynamic versus just plain sustainable.
Sure. Well, in sustainable, you're permitted to use herbicides and pesticides.
Okay.
In organic farming, you're not permitted to. In biodynamic has to be organic. In other words, organic is implied in biodynamic. But with biodynamic, you take it a step further in that you use special preparations that are based mostly on the cow manure, horn manure, horn silica. It gets a lot more complicated than that, and I don't know how much you want me to go into it at this point. But there's preparations that are made from valerian and from oak bark and various other herbs and plants and parts of the cow, and then also with biodynamic farming. So anyways, those are used as preparations on the vines and also on the soil during the growing season, kind of like you would be adding fertilizer. Instead, you're adding these special preparations that are unique to biodynamic farming. And then also with biodynamic farming, you follow the rhythm of the cosmos. So where
the timing, the lunar calendar, that type of thing.
The lunar calendar and the astrological calendar, and some of it sounds a little wacky, and some of it, seems a little wacky, but we just know that it works. We see the results, and we see how happy the plants are that are grown biodynamically. We see how great the fruit is, and then subsequently how great the wine is.
It seems to me, if you're interested in that much detail, from the soil to the growing of the vines to the harvesting and everything that you do to produce the grapes, with that much care, then the fruit's probably going to be a pretty good representation of that area.
That's right, and I think as much as anything, biodynamic farming is paying attention to details in the farming process and in the winemaking process, that maybe some details that you wouldn't have paid attention to before.
And your wines are all Demeter certified?
No, just the ones from the
for Sawyer Lindquist.
Yeah.
Now that's like a crowning jewel of biodynamic, is that not?
Well, I mean, it's the same. I mean, it's just biodynamic farming is a process. Okay. It's a method of farming. You can do it without being certified.
Okay.
But what you can't do is you can't list it on your label. You can't advertise that you do this, or you can't put it on your label unless you go through the certification process. It'd be a similar process to organic certification for a farm as well.
Okay.
And the process is kind of similar.
So they're a governing body, or a,
Correct.
Okay.
But they're their own governing body. Demeter is not affiliated with the FDA or the USDA, or it's its own entity that's based in Europe, that has an outpost here in Oregon, and they govern biodynamics. They come out and they inspect the vineyard, and they inspect our records, and they inspect the winery, and make sure that we're doing all the things that are supposed to be done for biodynamic farming. And they do that once a year. And if you pass, you get stamped approval, and you can use Demeter certified on your label then.
So you went through, when you first started, you were not doing biodynamic. This is an evolution as well as...
We were not doing biodynamic at other vineyards, but when we planted the Sawyer Lindquist vineyard, we started with biodynamic farming from the start. Okay. And it was actually fortuitous that we did that. We wanted to do it. We thought about it. We were on the fence about it. But at the time that we planted it, biodynamics was just starting to gain some momentum here in California. And some friends of mine in Europe who farm biodynamically said, if you're planting a new vineyard and you're thinking about biodynamics, do it from the start. Just do it. And so we did, and we're happy with that. We put the preparations on the soil before we even planted the first vines, that sort of thing, and then have followed it ever since. At first, we didn't know whether we were going to go for the certification process. We were on the fence about that. And then when the stack of paperwork came from Demeter, it was like, do we really want to go through this?
Oh, man.
Yeah, plus there's a fee involved. You pay Demeter, and that's how Demeter survives, though, so I understand why they charge a fee, because they couldn't be there if they didn't make some money. So we had to weigh that as well. Do we want to go through this process, do all this paperwork, pay a fee just for the right to put it on the label? And we decided that we would do that, and it's been a good thing. And there aren't that many people who even know what it is or appreciate the fact that it's on the label, but Whole Foods does.
Sure, and more people people do.
Yeah, and so that's an important, anyways. So,
again, no, it's back to your attention to detail and wanting to do what's best and what's right, and it also keeps you in the loop with your very precious product.
Right.
And while we're talking about your product, if you will, tell us a few of the wines that you make, what their blends are, what we can find when we look for Qupe wines.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, we mostly make Syrah. That's what we make. About 2/3 of our production is Syrah. Our biggest production is the wine that I mentioned earlier that we just call Central Coast Syrah. So that's the wine you're going to find in most stores and restaurants and so forth. But then I make a number of different single vineyard wines from Biennacido Vineyard, from the Sawyer Lindquist Vineyard. Yeah, and then on occasion I make one from another vineyard called Purísima Mountain Vineyard, which is down in Los Olivos in the San Ynez Valley, the Ballard area. So those I make a number of different Syrahs. And then I also make a single vineyard Grenache from the Sawyer Lindquist Vineyard. I make a Rhone style blend called Los Olivos Qupe, Syrah, Grenache, Mourvedre. And we also make a larger production Rhone style blend that also includes Tempranillo in the blend that we call Max Tap. We price that at the same price as our Central Coast Syrah, so we can sell it nationally. A blend of Syrah, Grenache, Mourvedre also, but with the inclusion then of Tempranillo. And with the Max Tap, that comes from grapes grown in both Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo County.
Okay.
So it carries a Central Coast appellation. And then, of course, Chardonnay, which I mentioned earlier, Marsanne, Roussanne, Viognier. We make quite a few different wines.
Quite a bit. And about aging, how long, let's say, one of your single vineyard Syrahs, what's a general standard? I mean, is there a specific time, or do they vary?
It varies depending on the wine. But usually with the single vineyard Syrahs, about 18 to 20 months in barrel.
Okay.
We age everything in French oak barrels. The only thing that's not aged in French oak barrels, some of the Rosé and Albarino that Louisa makes, she does those in stainless steel primarily. But everything else is done in French oak barrels. We use new oak for some wines, neutral oak for others. For our top Syrahs, we use a little bit of new oak. For our top Chardonnay, we use some new oak. For our Roussanne, we use one-year-old oak, barrels that have been used once for Chardonnay. That's what I find works best for Roussanne. So we've got it down.
It's crazy. When we got here, there was forklifts going everywhere. There's fruit being dumped in crushers and people running all over the place. So we were lucky to find a quiet corner to talk. Behind us is actually some of the library wines that they have going back how far?
Well, back to the 82.
82.
Yeah.
And then Jim has his library wines just on the other side over here that they go back as well, the Burgundies. But this is a fascinating kind of a picture of what goes on, especially during harvest time. And thank you very much for letting us come in here at this crazy time. You must have got off the phone and said, really? You want to do what, when?
Well, when I saw the date, it's like, well, it's going to be harvest, but you never know. You never know what harvest is going to be like. There are some times where you have a whole week that goes by with very little activity. This harvest has been relentless. It's just been, once we started, we haven't stopped because of the warmer weather. So
That's crazy. So when do you see any light at the end of the tunnel, any relief?
Well, we will. I mean, the early harvest, means we'll most likely finish early unless something really weird happens with the weather in the next few weeks. But, I expect to be done with all of my grapes for Qupe within probably 2 more weeks, which would be unheard of. We've never finished that early before.
Wow, that'll be great.
Yeah, I'll have well, you don't have it off because you're still monitoring fermentations, and there's still a lot going on.
With
Logistics, and because
relatively speaking, you get a break.
Well, and we've had 3 big vintages in a row also, so we have a lot of wine in barrel and a lot of logistics to work out, bottling and so forth. So there will still be a lot to do, but I'll be able to relax a little bit in October and hopefully watch the Dodgers in the World Series.
No doubt, right?
Yeah.
Well, the Diamondbacks are out, so I guess we'll go ahead and root with you. But I'd like to thank you very much, Bob. This is Bob Lindquist, and I'm telling you, this is a really neat operation. It's amazing how they multitask and coordinate. We have, like we said, Aubin Clement, which is a Burgundian wines. We also have Qupe, which is Bob's baby here, Syrah-driven, Rhone varietals. His wife, Luisa, she has Verdad, which is focusing mostly on Spanish varietals. And then they even have another project, Sawyer Lindquist, which is Demeter certified, biodynamic, and you do a little bit of Rhone and...
Just Pinot for that.
Oh, is it just Pinot?
Yeah. The Sawyer Lindquist fruit for like Syrah and Grenache, so forth, that goes into a Qupe single vineyard bottling.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So the only wine that we make under the Sawyer Lindquist vineyard label is the Pinot Noir, because it didn't fit in Verdad and it didn't fit in Qupe.
So you come up with a fourth, of course,
that's right.
like you do.
Yeah.
Well, it's fantastic. And you know what? Pioneering spirit like yours brings us out here to drink some fabulous and world-class Syrahs and wines. And it's another reason why Central Coast is one of our favorite stops along the road. And we'll see you down the road. Thank you again very much.